Hey, it's Clayton from howtodrawcomics.net and bartonbrostudios.com. In this tutorial, you're going to be learning how to draw the human eye from the front, side, and three-quarter views. Now, this lesson is actually part of a larger class where I'll take you through the process of drawing the human eye, not just from these standard points of view, but also from more dynamic top-down and bottom-up perspectives. I've got links to the class in the description below. You can access it on both howtodrawcomics.net and Skillshare. Alright, without further ado, let's jump straight into this. We'll start by drawing the front view of the eye, since that's one of the most common things that everybody wants to learn how to draw when they first pick up a pencil. It was probably one of the first things I ever drew was an eye from the front view. So let's just go ahead and do that. Now let me explain how I like to think about the shape of the eye from this particular view. If you take it just a basic block like this, so you could call it a rectangular prism if you like. It's not the most perfect rectangular prism I've ever drawn, but you take that and then all you do is you push it on its side in order to create this shape. Now the name of this shape, and it does have an actual name, escapes me right now. But that's basically what we're working with as far as the standard shape for the eye goes. And so when you can think about it in that way, it's not so hard to then go ahead and make a few tweaks and a few adjustments to that shape in order to capture finished eye. Okay, so this is the opening of the eye, of course. There's some anatomy you can add in around that. There's the pupil and the iris, and of course the eyebrows on top of that. But in terms of keeping it as simple as we possibly can to start out with, this is really the way in which I interpret the shape of the eye itself. So with that said, what you can do when it comes to practicing the eye is you can start out just practicing this shape. Get a feel for it, get used to it, try to become as comfortable as you possibly can with it. And then, once you've got an idea as to what this shape consists of, go on ahead and start to actually sculpt it out a little bit and create a more finished representation of how the eye actually looks. Now, as far as the construction method goes for a finished front view representation of the eye, here are the steps that I take. I usually start out with the top of the eye, and the top of the eye can be laid in on any number of angles. But let's just say that we started off with, somewhat of a downward slant. It's very, very subtle. It's not just necessarily straight across. You'll notice that there is a very slight bend to this line. It's not, again, it's not completely straight. And really, you don't want to keep any of your lines completely straight throughout the human face. You always want to have a little bit of character to them. But I start out with the top of the eye, and then from there, I'll draw out the inner eye. And this inner eye is going to lead in to the tear duct. Okay, so I hook it off there at the bottom. Once I've done that, I take my attention to the outside of the eye and I bring the contour down to about level with the tear duct, and then I'll change the trajectory of the contour, dipping it further down ever so slightly. You could, depending on what the facial expression is going to be of your character, you could certainly widen the eye, you could narrow the eyes. This is probably what we're drawing here is a resting eye. Just a default idle eye that's not expressing anything. And then that also is going to lead into the tear duct. Okay, so you can see that I've added a little bit of shape here to the bottom of the eye. Now, sometimes I'll be looking at the eye I've drawn and I'll go, well, you know what? I think that the back of the eye here could come in a little bit further, and I'll give it more of a slanted appearance. I'll increase the angle that I've drawn it on in order to capture the right shape that I'm looking for. So when you're watching the re-recording of this lesson, go ahead and pay attention to each one of those steps and practice it over and over again. Draw the top of the eye, the inner eye, the back of the eye, and then lead that round to the bottom of the eye. Once we've done that, we can then go ahead and start to add in the surrounding elements that will bring the eye through to completion. But this is really the main part. So let's now lay in the eyelashes. Okay. So with the eyelashes, I like to keep them as a very basic shape. So if we go up here to the first example, usually I'll draw them in something like this. I'll draw an eyelash in around the top of the eye, an eyelash in around the back of the eye, and then another one around the bottom of the eye. And depending on whether or not I'm drawing a male character or a female character, or a character that's just wearing makeup or not wearing makeup, in the end, that'll determine how much thickness you give the eyelashes of the eyes that you're drawing. So here we're not going to get too crazy. I'm going to just draw in some moderate eyelashes just to show you the example. So I establish the overall shape first, and we want to try to capture a nice clean shape for our eyelashes to start with. And then, so I'll add in the first set around the top, the second set around the sides of the eye, and you can see that just as before, they may have sharp corners, but the edges of these eyelashes have a bend to them. And then once I've added in the eyelashes around the side of the eye, I'll take my attention to the bottom and add in the final set around the base, leading that up into the tear duct. Once I've done that, you might be asking yourself, well, what about the inner eye? Do we add any thickness at least to the line there? And yes, we do. Usually I'll go ahead and I'll add just a little, you could think of it as a line weight. And then once we've done that, we can go ahead and actually start filling in that eyelash shape. I've increased the size of my brush here in order to do that a little faster. And we just want to carefully fill in that shape that we've outlined in order to complete the eyelashes. I'll do that around the top. We'll do it around the back of the eye as well, or the outer eye. Depends on what you want to label it as. Then finally we'll fill in the bottom eyelash. Now if you want, you can just, shade that in quickly if you're working with a sharper pencil. Now once again, you're going to have characters that have either thicker or very little eyelashes that aren't really this extravagant. So just keep that in mind. You can tweak these different assets that you apply to the facial features in a multitude of varying directions. All of this is customizable, which is what's really great about it. You just thicken up that initial shape if you want to get thicker eyelashes, and if you don't, then you'll make it thinner. But shape is really everything when it comes to drawing not only the head, but also the facial features on the head. Now, this is looking maybe a little bit too graphic, and so what we can do in order to introduce some more of a natural visual appeal to these eyelashes is we can actually go ahead and split some off from the main shape. And what this will do as an effect is make them look a little brushier, like they're actually made of hair, rather than just a flat shape that's surrounding the opening of the eye. And usually, the points at which I add in these offshoots of eyelash are around the top of the eye, in between the top eyelash shape and the side eyelash shape, and then in between the side one and also the bottom one. And you can see that that's all that's really required. Now, what you don't want to do is start, adding in eyelashes that are single lines. That's probably not going to work out very well, and it just won't look good. It won't have a finished professional quality to it. So always define your eyelashes with a shape first. Once we've gone ahead and placed in the eyelashes, what we can start doing is establishing the surrounding anatomy of the eye. And usually what that's going to consist of is the crease in the upper region of the eye where the top eyelid folds in underneath the eye socket. And in order to depict that, what I'll usually do is lay in a line right here where the inner eye meets the brow as it leads into the nose. And then I'll place in another line that intersects that at the top and then runs back in toward the back of the eye, or the outer eye, if you will. You can add line weights to the contours that you're drawing your eye with, that are defining your eye, in order to once again get that professional finished quality, a professional look to it. Makes it look really polished. I'm just going to move this eye example down because we're going to add some eyebrows in on top. And once we've drawn out this top eyelid region, we can also go ahead and add in some very subtle render lines there just to thicken up the form. And we can also add in an indication of the bottom edge of the eye socket. And usually I'll just add in a few lines there, like so, in order to indicate that. It could be a single line, it could be multiple lines, like I've just placed in. Just something to indicate the form, the anatomy around that area. Now, of course, this eye is missing a vital component right now. It's missing not two vital components. It's missing the pupil and it's missing the iris as well. So let's go ahead and draw that in. So the top eyelid actually rests over the iris and the pupil, which means usually rather than drawing it right in the middle, you're going to be drawing the iris somewhat sitting underneath the top of the eye. So I'll usually sketch out circular shape for the iris. And you'll notice that it's not completely circular. Again, anything I'm drawing, I want to try to add some character to it. So I'll mess around with the shape somewhat. Sometimes I'll squash it, sometimes I'll straighten up the lines at certain points on a rounded object or a rounded element, such as the iris here, and that just adds additional visual interest to what it is you're drawing. Next up, we'll lay in the pupil. Now remember that the pupil can dilate, and so there's going to be times where it's a little pinpoint, and there's going to be occasions where it actually widens when, the character is scared or freaked out. So keep that in mind that once again, this is another customizable element, the pupil, that can allow you to produce certain emotions, emit certain emotions within your character and show them what they're feeling to the audience. Cool. So now that we've gone ahead and placed down the pupil and the iris, let's actually lay in the eyebrow. Now, just like with the eye, the eyebrow can be simplified down into a very basic shape. And this is the shape that I usually like to use. It only has four sides as well. So let's go up the top here and do an example of that. The eyebrow consists of a bottom edge, an inner edge, just like the eye, top edge, and then an outer edge. Okay, so it's not unlike the eye. Now what I will do is I'll go ahead and I'll actually tweak that shape somewhat. I'll fashion it. I'll sculpt it out a little bit to something that looks more like this. So I'll add a downward bend to that shape, and I'll curve out the inner eyebrow somewhat. I'll then add an additional point to the base of the eyebrow, right in the middle of its lower edge. And then I'll scoop the contour back up into the outer edge of the eyebrow, and then fold it back down, hooking it around the underlying form that it sits upon. Once I've got that shape established, which is, really the key to capturing a vivid looking, cool eyebrow, what you'll then want to do is fill it in with some rendering. So I'm going to just demonstrate that real quickly for you here. What that'll look like is very thin, very subtle lines that flow through the eyebrow shape in the direction that the hair should be moving in, that the hair is combed in. And what you'll notice is that I'm grouping some of these, you could think of them as eyebrow strands or eyebrow clumps together, while others I'm spreading apart and giving a lot of distance between. And the reason for that is, here's what you want to avoid. You do not want to draw these eyebrow strands like this, because otherwise that's going to lead to a very patterny look, which you want to avoid when it comes to more natural, organic looking subject matter, such as hair or eyebrow fur. And so that's the same deal here. So once again, what we can do if we want to practice our eyebrows is we can start out with that basic shape and then slowly but surely construct a more refined look for the eyebrow. And what this rendering does is it makes it look less like the eyebrow has just been painted or stuck onto your character's face. You can also go ahead sometimes if you want to, and you can split off an eyebrow strand in the inner eyebrow. Again, just to give it that hair-like appearance. Similar to what we did with the eyelashes. So now let's apply an actual eyebrow to our eye example that we've done up here. All right, now the eyebrow, depending on whether or not you're drawing a male or a female character, feminine or masculine character, usually male characters will tend to have brushier, thicker, lower sitting eyebrows. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, it seems as though we're drawing up more of a feminine eye here, which, they're really great for demonstrating eyelashes and that kind of thing. And so we'll keep our eyebrow more feminine as well. And for them, what you want to keep in mind is that they're going to sit a little higher above the eye, and they'll typically be thinner, less brushier, less heavy looking. So I'm going to go ahead and very lightly draw out the eyebrow shape to begin with, starting with the bottom edge. Once I've got the base established, I'll draw in the inner eyebrow wall. Add a curve to the top of it, and then lay in the outer eyebrow. And you can see how very lightly I've drawn that. It might even be difficult for you to see there. But the reason that I keep it so light is just in case I mess up along the way. I like to trial test what I'm drawing first before I go ahead and do exactly what I'm about to do, set it in stone with a heavier outline. And I would highly recommend that you do the same thing. Start out very light, and then once you're happy with what you're seeing on the page, go over the top of it. Lay in that final contour. Place down the line weights. And line weights, by the way, if you're wondering, are just varying levels of thickness within the line that you're placing down onto the page. Okay, so you can see here that, well, you can see with what will happen with this eyebrow is I'll give the outer shape a much darker outline than I will the interior rendering. And that would be an example of how to use line weights. But you could also go ahead and thicken up your lines at the corners where they meet other edges. Okay, so I'm very happy with that shape. And once again, I can't emphasize this enough. Focus on capturing a solid, good looking shape for whatever it is you're drawing. All right, next up, let's place in the eyebrow fur rendering. You can see I'm adding a bit of a curve to each one of these lines as well. Once again, that'll give us a more natural look. And I am somewhat clumping these eyebrow strands together. Sometimes I'm doubling them up, sometimes I'm leaving them as a single line. Once again, you want to create some randomization within the rendering of hair especially. And it's quite difficult to do for us. It's surprisingly difficult because as human beings, we habitually try to look for patterns and also produce them. So you want to be consciously avoiding that when you're laying in eyebrow hair or anything else that you want to have look more natural because nature is, even though there's some order to it, it's fairly random. At least it can seem random on the surface. Okay. And once again, you'll notice that the direction of these lines as I draw them into the eyebrow shape are being combed back to establish a sense of flow within the movement of these eyebrow hairs. Okay, so think of that. Think about combing back the hair in the direction that you want those eyebrows to flow. All right, once we've done that, there's also some additional little points of rendering that we can use to define some of the surrounding anatomy of the brow itself. And usually what you'll find is that the upper brow bone will lead down into the top of the nose. And so in order to indicate that transition, what I like to do is just, lay in a very subtle line to indicate it. You can also add in some additional doubled up line rendering around the inner eye there. And then another line to describe the fold of the bottom eyelid. And other than that, this is what you could certainly call a finished front representation of the human eye. Step by step. Okay, so let's go ahead and move straight on to the side of the eye. Side of the eye also starts out with a very basic shape. So it's less of a rectangle and more of a triangle that has been pushed onto its side. You could also think of it like a piece of pie. So it's got a top edge, a bottom edge, and then the front of the eye. And it really doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. Of course, when it comes to drawing some eyelashes onto the eye, well, we're going to notice that they actually fan out toward the front. Okay, so we get a good sense of the direction of these eyelash planes. And the same thing will occur on the bottom as well. You'll notice that the eyelashes actually push forward. And the idea is that, well, the reason that nature has designed them in this way is so that if it's raining or if there's, sand blowing around, these eyelashes will catch that and stop it from going into our eyes. Same with the actual eyebrow. That's what it's designed for. Can't tell you how many times I've bumped my head, hit my brow instead of my eye, thankfully. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and draw a finished representation of the eye's side view. So I'll start out with just that really basic shape, beginning with the top edge. And then the bottom edge. And you'll notice that there's more of an angle applied to the bottom edge of the eye in this view. And the reason for that is because the top of the eye somewhat flattens out a little bit. Usually, again, it rests over the top of the eye. That could be due to gravity, I'm not sure. But uh, ultimately, the bottom eyelid will always sit lower than the top eyelid. Okay, cool. Once we've got that basic shape established, we can then go ahead and we'll just resize that a little bigger so we can see it. We can then go ahead and lay in the eyelashes. Okay, so just as before, we're going to start by defining the shape of the eyelashes. Fanning them out at the front. And at the back, we'll also do the same thing. We'll also fan them out a little bit, but just not as much. And we'll do the same thing around the bottom of the eye. Fanning them out, front and pulling them back in. Once we've done that, we can fill in our eyelashes. And you'll notice that what happens when you apply eyelashes to the eyes of your characters is those eyes look much bigger. This is the same effect that occurs in real life when you wear mascara or you wear thicker eyelashes. More attention is drawn to them. It essentially frames the opening of the eye and draws more attention to that area of your face. And that's a good thing because a lot of expression comes through the eyes. You can tell a lot about a person, oftentimes how they're thinking, what they're feeling, just by looking at some of the cues that their eyes are giving off. That's what makes poker players so dangerous. They're very good at being able to read what people are, what emotional state people are in, just by looking at the expressions on their face, the micro expressions. But eyes give off a lot of them. Because when you think about it, there's that big ring of muscle that sits around the eye, and so it's capable of a wide range of movement, both subtle and also quite prominent. Once we've filled in our eyelashes, we can then go ahead and we can place in some offshoots of eyelash hair in order to make them look like they're actually made of hair rather than just a solid shape. Now you can experiment with different shapes for your eyelashes. By all means, you can experiment with different shapes for your eyes as well. Next up, what we're going to do is draw in the iris and the pupil. Now, the iris and the pupil from the side view, this is actually very interesting. So we'll start off by laying in the iris. It's going to sit a little bit underneath the top eyelid, just as before. The pupil is really where we see a major difference. Now, most people think just intuitively that the pupil is going to sit right at the front of the eye, but that's actually not the case. The pupil actually sits back inside the iris, because the iris is actually a cup. Now, we're not necessarily going to draw it and depict it here, but there's also a membrane that sits over the top of the iris and protects it. Once we've drawn in the iris and the pupil, let's now start to lay in some of the surrounding anatomy. Now we can draw a contour upward from the top of the eye and into the upper region, where we'll fold the top eyelid up underneath the upper edge of the eye socket. It's going to look a little bit like that. Just going to tweak the shape of my iris here for a moment. Move the pupil up. There we go. Oh, you can also go ahead and add in a reflection to your iris as well, if you'd like to make the eye look a little more wet, a little more shiny. Because certainly, if you've ever had dry eyes before, it's not a pleasant feeling. So the eyes certainly do. It's a great way to describe the material of the eyes almost, and how light reflects off of them. You can add that to both of your eyes. I usually just draw out a little bit of a shape for that reflection, and then I erase or I fill in on top of that the iris just to get rid of that contour underneath it. Okay, wonderful. Once we've got the side of the eye figured out, let's talk about the eyebrow and how that looks to us when presented in the profile view. You can also use a very simple shape for it as well. And the way in which I interpret it on a basic level is something that looks like this. Okay, we've got a front for the eyebrow, we've got the top, we've got the bottom, and then it hooks back around once again, following the shape of the underlying anatomy, the underlying skull. Okay, so that's the kind of shape that we'll be going for here when we draw in our eyebrow. And in fact, if you want to, you could indicate where the front of the brow is and where it joins onto the nose. So I'll lightly lay that in because it'll give us a bit of an indication as to where to place that eyebrow. Okay, great. So we'll start at the front of the brow, laying in the inner edge of our eyebrow, and then we'll pull it back, defining the lower edge. And I am trying to think about the way in which the eyebrow will conform to the general geometry of this area of the face, because that's exactly what it does. I'll then go ahead and place in the top edge of the eyebrow. Again, I'm very lightly drawing this out. And then I'll hook it back around like so. Now, in fact, probably haven't taken it back far enough here, so I'm going to do exactly that. So I'll pull it back even further here. I've probably drawn this side view of the eye a little larger than our front view actually, so I'm going to shrink it down a bit, giving us more room on the page. Okay, so now let's try that again. I'll hook the back of the eyebrow around. And I think that's looking great. I'm just going to make a few tweaks here so you can see that I'm simply drawing in another line to thicken up the inner edge of the eyebrow. And I'll erase the lighter one that I drew in before. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So now I'll go over the top of that eyebrow shape, define it with some more clarity, a thicker outline, making it nice and vivid before we start to add in that rendering. And each step of the process that I'm going through here, you can execute repeatedly in order to really get a handle on it. And try to perfect every step. You know, if you have trouble drawing eyes, repetition is the key. If you have trouble drawing anything, repeat each one of those steps separately until you really get it. Okay, awesome. So now we'll lay in those eyebrow strands. Now, they're going to be flowing in somewhat of a different direction this time around. So instead of curving back toward the eye, or toward the outer edge of the eye, they're going to be flowing inward toward the front of the eyebrow. Pretty much in the opposite direction. Now, this might not be entirely accurate, but it does look good when you draw it down onto the page. And so that's where one of the everlasting clashes comic artists have to face starts to come into play. Or any artist really that wants to go for a more stylized approach with their art. Weighing up the decision that you make between what looks good on the page and what is actually true to reality. And there's a lot of decisions that you may have to make later on down the track that wouldn't work in real life, but look really cool on the page. So always go for coolness. Always go for the visual experience of the audience over realism, because sometimes real is just kind of boring to look at. It's bland. People engage with movies and comic books and video games because they want to escape from reality. So it's good to give them that kind of experience. Okay, great. So that's our side view representation of the eye completed. Move that up here. And now let's tackle the 3/4 view of the eyes. So the 3/4 view is, well, we're going to be drawing up two different eyes here. And so what we need to consider is the foreshortening that's going to be applied to them as we represent the eyes in 3D, essentially, in the 3/4 view. And so this is what happens, right? We take this basic eye shape that we learned about to begin with, and now we're going to be applying perspective to it. So over to the right here, what I'll do is I'll draw out a line that represents the level at which our eyes sit on the face. And normally, if we're looking at the head straight on, we would see the eyes having an equal eye width of space between them, and they would also be of equal widths as well. However, when we turn the head to observe it in the 3/4 view, what we end up with is a skewed representation of those measurements. Okay. So the distance between the eyes will be smaller than the width of the eye that is closest to us, and the far eye will be smaller than both of those. All right, so I'm going to lay in the basic shape of the eyes first up over here. So that'd be the eye that's closest to us. The distance between that eye and the far eye. And then we've got the far eye, which is, of course, going to have less width now that it's slightly turned away from us. And what you'll also notice is, due to the foreshortening of this basic shape, what we end up getting is some distortion that happens within it. We see that, in fact, there's a larger amount of space on the inner eye when we're looking at the far side of the eye, and a larger amount of space on the outer eye when we're looking at the one that is closest to us. Okay, so it's important to keep that in mind when it comes to drawing the eyes on the 3/4 view, right? They're going to change, both of them. Okay, so we'll start out with the eye that is closest to us, and I'm going to run through these examples a little bit faster now that we've had an introduction into the front and side views of the eye. You'll be fairly familiar with the process at this point. We're going to start out with the top of the eye. Again, lightly sketching it in there. The inner eye that is going to run down from the top of that upper edge. And then the back of the eye, which will flow down into the base of the eye. I'm going to add a greater angle to the back of the eye there. Erase it away. So what I'm going to focus on first up is just the shapes that we want to be looking at when we're observing the eye on this angle, or both the eyes on this angle. Now the eye that's closest to us, it really doesn't change too much. There's a slight amount of distortion that's applied to it, but not a whole lot. However, when we're looking at the eye that is further away, that's where we do see quite a significant change end up occurring. All right, so again, we want roughly just short of an eye distance between the two. We're going to see a slight outline here where the nose leads into the brow. And then we got the eye that's further away. The eye that's further away is simply not going to have as much width applied to it as the eye that is closest to us. It's going to be smaller, but not in terms of height, just in terms of width. And depending on how far away the head is rotated from us, these effects will be pushed further. Okay, so the far eye will get narrower and narrower and narrower, as will the eye that's closest to us for that matter. And in fact, it is somewhat narrow when we're looking at it in the three-quarter view as opposed to the front view where we see its full width. Okay, so that's the basic shapes that we're dealing with when it comes to drawing the three-quarter view of the eyes. And you can see that it's pretty much the same shape. It's just that now it's been tweaked, it's been morphed a little bit. Next up, what I'm going to do is draw in some of the surrounding anatomy, even before we start to lay in the eyelashes here. And at this point, we know pretty much what that consists of. Over here, we've mostly already done that for the far eye. We've got the outline of the nose. Once we've gone ahead and drawn out our eyes, our eye opening, we can then go in and add those eyelashes. And as you'll see, we're pretty much executing the exact same steps over and over and over again for each of these examples. That gives us extra practice, of course, which is wonderful, but at the same time, it also makes the whole process so much easier for us. You know, when you can go through the same series of steps over and over and over again, it means that you don't have to really guess your way through it anymore. You've got your technique down, you've got your method. Now all you have to focus on is actually getting it to look good. And the more brain power that you can dedicate to that particular task, the better. Okay, so now we'll fill in our eyelashes on this side of the face. We'll do the same thing around the bottom eyelashes and around the top. And you can be clean cut with this. You can be a little rougher if that's the kind of style that you'd like to go for. That's completely fine too. Again, this is just the way in which I approach it. And sometimes I do get a little bit rougher because I want, a more natural look and less of a clean cut appearance. You yourself might even have multiple styles. I know I certainly do. I've got my more dark fantasy, really detailed look for my art, but then I've also got this more clean cut appearance that I'd use maybe for a sci-fi comic or illustration. So different styles are going to work for different genres better than others. Okay, great. So we've got our eyelashes now drawn in. We'll do the exact same thing on the other eye. Outlining them first. And you'll see that they're fanning out just that little bit more on the far side of the face. So really try to practice that eyelash shape. Once again, we've got very sharp corners, but the edges in between them have a curve to them. And so what you get is this nice, smooth flowing sharpness to the shape. Keep your corners sharp, but keep your edges soft, curved. All right, we'll fill those in too. So we're really giving our attention, our full attention to the eyes at this point in time. And we'll do the same thing for all the facial features so that we can get a real proper handle on them. As I've said before, if you really want to get good at drawing eyes or any facial feature for that matter, spend a good few days doing these exercises repeatedly. Don't just draw the eyes from the three-quarter view once. Draw them from the three-quarter view over and over and over again. Fill up an entire page just with three-quarter view eyes. And you'll get really, really good at it, at drawing them from that angle. The other angles of the eye, of course, which we'll go over and after this, they're a little bit more difficult, but now that we've got an understanding of what the basic shape of the eye consists of, it should be much easier to understand. That's why figuring out, how to draw the standard views of anything, the eyes, the nose, the entire head, it can really help us out when it comes to those more dynamic points of view. Okay, so to complete our eyelashes on our three-quarter view eyes, I'm going to add in a few offshoots of eyelash hair. I'll thicken up the inner eye line just a little to indicate that, maybe there is some mascara following around the shape of the eye. And then I'll do the exact same thing on the opposite side of the face, mirroring all the steps that I'm taking here. Now, in reality, of course, it's not necessarily going to take you this long to actually draw out an eye. Initially, maybe. But as I said, we're taking our time to go through each step here. And the idea is that you take your time at first. And as you get more comfortable, you'll inevitably get faster at this. And it won't be so taxing. You'll find it easier and it'll be a total breeze. Eventually, with enough practice. Okay, cool. So once we've got the eyes drawn in there, or the eye opening and the eyelashes surrounding them, let's place in the iris and the pupil. So I'm roughly going to outline the iris to begin with. You'll notice that I actually don't link the iris up at the base. I leave it completely open. You know, the colorists will do their thing if they decide to color it and, fill it in. But broken lines can be quite handy when it comes to capturing, once again, that polished, professional looking presentation at the end. This is why I say, leave the contours of the outline for your lips open once in a while. Break them up. You don't necessarily always have to make it a complete outline. And it just adds so much more of a stylized finish to your work. Okay, so we've got the reflection drawn in there. We'll do the same thing on the opposite eye. And notice what happens here. What you'll see is that the width of the iris is also going to become a little bit squashed because of the additional level of foreshortening that's been applied to it here. Okay, so not only is it the shape of the eye itself that ends up becoming distorted, it's actually the interior shapes that we place within it for the iris and the pupil that also have that same effect applied to them. Okay, and we'll go ahead and we'll lay in the reflection of the eye on this one as well. Okay, great. And usually what I'll also do to really polish this up is I'll thicken up the top of the outline that I've established for the iris, like so. Okay, great. So that's our 3/4 view eyes pretty much completed. Let's go ahead and give them some eyebrows. And what we're going to see is some similar effects actually take place here. We're going to be foreshortening the eyebrows themselves. All right. Now, in order to find the placement of the eyebrows in the 3/4 view, I know that there's this underside plane of the brow that I need to consider. And so what I'll typically do is I'll draw a diagonal line upward to where I would like the eyebrows to sit. And that'll allow me to find where the front of the eyebrows begin. Once I've figured that out, of course, I can go ahead and just erase that line. But it's a handy little trick if you're ever finding that the 3/4 views of your head simply seem to have eyebrows that aren't positioned quite right. Now, just as before, I'm going to start out by outlining the shape that I want to go with for the eyebrows. Drawing at this larger scale, by the way, individual facial feature, I don't know if it's just me, but you might also find it just that little bit more challenging because you don't get that overall look at exactly how everything is coming together. Okay, so we will hook the back of the eyebrow around the eye. And what you'll notice is this back section of the eyebrow is going to be more stretched out. And the front section, it's going to be larger because it is in fact closer to us. Slightly closer to us, but still closer to us. And we want to try to push that effect where we can because it's going to allow us to accentuate the depth within our drawing. Okay, so we'll thicken up the outline for the top of our eyebrow and around the front as well. Taking our attention to the back and doing the exact same thing. Next up, we'll establish the eyebrow on the far side of the face. Now, what I'm going to do to help me out with this is I'm actually going to draw the underside of the brow out from behind the top of the eye and hook it back up into the forehead of the character. Okay, so yeah, we have that nice soft cushiony bit just above the eye there that sits on the underside plane. And what we're going to notice here as we draw in the eyebrow is it's actually going to hook around that area. And sometimes the eyebrow on the far side of the head is actually going to obscure the far eye just a little bit. Okay, so that takes care of the far side eyebrow. We'll go over the top of that, defining its outline. It's once we've done that, we can go ahead and start filling in the rendering for those eyebrows. Now you'll notice that the front of the eyebrow in the far side of the face here is much thicker than the side that's closest to us, so I'm going to go ahead and just even those out a bit. You know, symmetry is, as always, ever so important to make sure it's maintained. Okay, wonderful. So now that that's done, I'm using a very, very light pinpoint thin line in order to start rendering out these eyebrows. Splitting up these clumps as I go, and really, you could you could add a minimal amount of eyebrow strands here in order to get this exact same look. It'd still have a stylized appeal to it. I guess the tone that you'd be creating just wouldn't be as dark. Combing those eyebrow furs back in the direction we want them to flow around the eyebrow. And that's exactly what rendering is great for, is it does describe the form that we're laying it on top of. That's exactly what's happening here. Now, because of course the eyebrows sit on an underlying form, they're not actually a form in and of themselves. That's what they're describing. Okay, cool. So we've got those drawn in on the side of the face that's closest to us. Let's do the same thing on the opposite side. Of course, they're being combed back in the opposite direction here. Toward the outer edge of the face. And that pretty much completes the standard views of the eye. The last thing that we can add in, of course, just as a finishing touch, is we can place in some indications of the anatomy surrounding the eye, just as we did with the previous examples. So I'm just darkening up some of the contours I've already laid in, doubling up others, and then what I'll do is just place in some very subtle rendering around the brow as it leads into the nose section. I'll add a thinner render line running along the inner edge of the eye. And finally, we can describe the bottom edge of the eye socket, just that little tiny indentation, and a single line to indicate the bottom eyelid folding up against it. You do the same thing in the opposite side of the face. As you can see, there's actually not a whole lot we need to add in there just to hint at that basic anatomy. But it is good to describe the surrounding anatomy of the face when drawing in the facial features, because it just makes them look like they're a part of the face rather than being stuck on like paper cutouts. We want everything to look as cohesive as possible. Now, as I was saying before, the more that you turn the head away from the viewer, from the point of view at which we're looking at it from, the more you'll see those distortions happening within the shape of the eye. And what I wanted to do here is just some quick examples of that. Okay, so for example, here we've turned the head even further away. The eyes are looking more and more squashed. This example, we may almost be looking at the complete side of the head. And in fact, the eye will be sitting on the outside of the face there almost, from this point of view. And in some cases, the nose will be obscuring it as well. So just try to keep that in mind when it comes to drawing the eyes, not only in the 3/4 position, but every other point of rotation that the head has in between the front view and the side view. Other than that, this is what the standard views of the eye entails. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the tutorial and that you got a ton of value out of it. If you did, remember that this lesson is part of a larger class which you can access on howtodrawcomics.net and Skillshare via the links in the description below. It's going to take you through not only the standard front, side, and 3/4 views of the eye, but also the more dynamic perspectives of the eye shown from the top down and bottom up points of view. Alright, that's it from me today. Until next time, keep drawing.